Right, welcome everybody. Thank you for showing up. I like these conversations. So my name is Aino Corry. I'm from Denmark. Jag pratar också lite svensk, men jag kommer inte att göra det här på svenska. So as you can see, I did a PhD, but not in anything that had anything to do with retrospectives. It was about programming language constructs, and it's so many years ago so that I've actually forgotten most of it. So I've been facilitating retrospectives for about 14 years now, for clients, for the groups that I worked in, but also for my family. So every time we've been on vacation, I make a little retrospective with my family, and my kids are like, "Ugh, Mom." But that's how it is when they're teenagers. They would do that to anything, right? But it's actually pretty good with these retrospectives. So even though I believe that I'm talking to my family every day, just doing a retrospective from time to time actually gives me more information. What I'm going to talk about today is retrospectives antipatterns. So because of all the mistakes that I've made facilitating retrospectives over the years, I ended up writing a book about what can go wrong and how you can get out of these antipattern situations. So the aim of this talk is that whenever you say to your developers or whoever you are facilitating retrospectives for that it's retrospective time, they'll look like this. And they're not trying to run away. They're really happy and they're looking forward to the retrospective. So after these 40 minutes, whenever you tell people you're going to facilitate a retrospective, this is what they're going to look like. But first I'm going to talk to you about what I mean when I say antipatterns and what I mean when I say retrospectives. So we're going to start in hell. You know what hell is, right? It is a very warm place. It is eternal fire. It is where you go if you haven't behaved well. Everybody here, I suspect, knows what hell is. But what about this? Niflheim. How many of you know what Niflheim is? Yes, much higher percentage of people knowing it up here than when I'm doing this in Australia and America, because Niflheim is the Scandinavian hell. This is where the Vikings went if they didn't kill in the right way, right? And why am I talking about hell and Niflheim? I actually have a reason for doing it, apart from the fact that I think it's funny that we have two different kinds of hell. But I want to talk about it because I want to tell you what the difference is between a pattern and an antipattern. As you know, a pattern is an abstract solution to an often recurring problem in a domain. And what you do when you describe a pattern is that you describe your experience so that other people can make use of that experience. It's a literary form. It's important to have a pattern name. It's important to have the domain description, the context and forces. And then, of course, you have the abstract pattern solution that can be implemented 1,000,000 times over without doing it in the same way twice. And then you have the benefits and you have the negative consequences. So that's a pattern as we know it and love it, like observer, composite, visitor, all the other patterns. But what is an antipattern then? An antipattern is almost the same, except that the solution that you think is a good solution is actually a bad solution. And the negative consequences are larger than the positive benefits. But the antipattern description is not just a negative thing where you say, "Oh, that sucked. Never gonna do that again." It actually gives you a refactored solution for how to get out of that situation. So for instance, when people didn't behave well, hell was invented so that people would start behaving well. And it worked really, really well in most parts of the world. But then when the Vikings started acting up, they tried to implement hell in Scandinavia. But unfortunately, thinking about somewhere where it was eternally hot just made the Vikings think, "Oh great, we're going to get drinks on the beach." So we had to make a refactored solution to actually make them behave well, which is where Niflheim comes in, right? And that close relation between a pattern and an anti-pattern solution, I think, is crucial. And that's when I'm talking about the things that can go wrong in retrospectives. I'm not trying to say that you're stupid, or at least not more stupid than I am, but just saying that something that is a good solution somewhere is not necessarily a good solution somewhere else. It's a bit like the microservices. It's a very good solution in some domains, not a good solution in other domains. So that was Antipatterns for you. Now, what do I mean when I say retrospectives? Retrospectives is a way to give people a room to share what has happened, to share their experiences about the sprint, to share their experiences about the project or what the vacation in my family. But not just share, but also appreciate. And appreciate not only the good things, but also the bad things. Appreciating, okay, that didn't work as you intended, or that was harder than you thought, or that surprised us, or that blew up. So appreciating both the positive and the negative things. And then the crucial thing that makes you sell it to the management is that you learn together. That you learn from these things so that you can improve the system that is the team that you're working with. So that is the Antipatterns and the retrospectives. And in a retrospective, we have different stages. And I'm going to take the 5 stages of a retrospective that was described in Diana Larsen and Esther Derby's book, Agile Retrospectives, Making Good Teams Great. Because I think that those 5 stages are sometimes undervalued, and I want to make a course for every stage that they talk about. The first stage is setting the stage, getting ready, and it's a crucial part of a retrospective. Some people just jump into the data gathering. They just go into a room and they say what went well, what went wrong. But you actually need to set the stage. And there are some things that you can do in here. You can follow up on the action points from last time. You can maybe say there's a theme for this retrospective. Maybe it's a general retrospective, or it's something about the learning or the test process or whatever. But also, and this is important, you have some sort of check-in. You ask everybody something, and then they say something. And the fact that they say something at the beginning of the retrospective makes it so much easier for them to say something throughout the retrospective. If you allow people to be silent at the beginning, it's much easier for them to stay silent. And when they have unmuted, if it's online, you can just say, stay unmuted. Don't mute yourself unless you have a screaming baby or a barking dog behind you. Because if you're unmuted, it's much easier to say something. You're removing one of the hindrances for saying something, for reacting, for laughing, for snorting, for maybe growling, or just drinking coffee, which makes people feel more like they're together in the same room. This setting the stage is important. And the question that you ask is important. Sometimes if I'm with a new team and I think they're very serious and grown up, I ask a very serious and grown up question like, tell me a success from the last sprint, or what did you take too seriously in the last sprint, or what did you not take seriously enough? But when I think people are more playful, I sometimes ask them, could you explain if your team was a car, what car would it be? And then we can have a laugh and a talk about that. Even if people don't know anything about cars, that will just make us laugh even more. Or maybe saying, can you describe the last sprint as a weather forecast? Because they will laugh about that. And when people laugh together, they send all these happiness hormones throughout the body. And when people are laughing together and they get these happiness hormones together, they think they like each other. And if they think they like each other, they might even end up actually liking each other. And that will make it easier to be a team. But also sometimes when you ask people to describe the last sprint as a weather forecast, you're giving them a little bit of distancing. So maybe they can say, oh, it was a thunder weather, or there was a storm, and it might be easier to say that than, oh, it was a complete fuck up and nothing worked as we thought. So it might be easier for people to say something. So setting the stage, even though it's just maybe 5 to 10% of the time, it's crucial for the rest of the retrospective. The next is gather data. And this is what people normally think about when they think about retrospectives. When they think about retrospectives and they're asking for new ways of retrospectives, what they're actually sharing is ways of gathering data. Ways of putting post-it notes on a wall, or different posters, or having a sailboat or a wade retrospective or whatever. They're talking about how to gather data. Data can also be burn down charts or regression tests or input from the users or whatever. This is the easiest part of a retrospective for most teams. And yet, there are some things that can go wrong when we look at this. So the first anti-pattern I want to talk about is called the Wheel of Fortune. And for the Wheel of Fortune, you should imagine that you're in a Tivoli and you're turning the Wheel of Fortune, and then sometimes the number is correct and you get a prize, and other times the number is not correct and you don't get a prize. And it's a bit the same for some retrospectives. Because some people are saying, we want to not waste so much time on the retrospective. So we want to make our retrospective more efficient. So we want to have the retrospectives in 20 minutes. I even heard some people say to me, we're so good at retrospectives, we do it in 15 minutes. And then I'm saying, feel sorry about your wife. But, oh, that was a different talk, sorry. Anyway, so what happens sometimes in the Wheel of Fortune is that people, they want to gather data quickly and get through the retrospective quickly. So they put up 3 posters, start, stop, continue, and then they gather data, then say, okay, we want more pair programming, we want less meetings, and we want to stop ignoring the pull requests. Great. This can be finished quickly, right? Because if we want more pair programming, we'll just schedule pair programming 3 days a week, 3 hours every day with all these people. Problem solved, right? If we want less meetings, those stand-up meetings in the morning, we only need 2 a week. Or maybe those refinement meetings, some other people can do that. Or maybe the retrospectives, actually, we only need it once a month or once every other month. And we've solved it, right? And stop ignoring the pull requests, well, we implement a bot in our Slack or something like that so that people will never forget it. Great, we solved all the problems, we walk out the retrospective, we're happy, right? We might be happy because it's a Wheel of Fortune. It could be that the problem with not having pair programming is indeed that we forget it, right? And if that is actually the problem, then scheduling more pair programming is indeed the solution. But what if the fact that we don't have pair programming is not the problem in itself, but just a symptom of a bigger problem? What if the problem is that there is no psychological safety, that people don't feel they can trust each other to look at them while they're coding? What if they don't know how to do it because it's remote? What if those are the problems? Then scheduling more pair programming will actually make the problem worse than it was before. And the same with less meetings. What if the problem is not that we have too many meetings, but that we have really bad meetings? Then having less meetings is actually also going to make the problem worse, because the few meetings we have left are still terrible, and they definitely won't get anything done. And I suspect you could imagine problems with stop ignoring the pull requests as well, that it might not be because people are forgetting it. And that, I think, is a big problem with having these fast-paced retrospectives, is that you forget a crucial part of the retrospective, and that is to generate insights. You remember I said at the beginning, it's about sharing and appreciating and learning. And if we don't generate insights, if we don't try to figure out what is causing these things, are these symptoms or are these problems, then we'll end up in a situation where the problems still persist. And we have these Groundhog Day retrospectives where people keep talking about the same things. It's a bit like putting a Band-Aid on skin cancer. You might not be able to see it for a while, but it's still there, and it'll pop up somewhere else. This is the most important part of a retrospective, and it is the most difficult part of the retrospective. And it is a part of the retrospective that most people skip. And I guess that, I mean, of course, you've never skipped that part of the retrospective. Everybody in this room always doing it, I know that. But for the ones who don't, you can take this advice with you. Talk about these things. Talk about the little post-it note that says we need more pair programming. Or talk about the little post-it note that says, why do people continue to ignore my pull request? Sometimes it's enough just to have a conversation about these things, to ask everybody in a round robin, what do you think is causing this? Sometimes you need to dive a little bit further. You could do a 5 whys or a 5 how in interview. The 5 whys and the 5 hows are not indigenous to retrospectives. It's something that you can do in any course analysis. Problem with that is that you're only going down and finding one cause. And sometimes you have something which is a little bit more complex, and in those cases you might use a fishbone diagram or Ishikawa analysis. Let me give you an example. It could be in a team that you have this recurring thing that you're missing the deadlines, and you want to figure out why is it we're missing the deadlines. And of course, if you just have a very quick retrospective, you should just come up with don't miss the deadlines, or work harder, work faster. That would definitely solve it, right? Maybe not. So what you might do is that you say, let's have a whole retrospective about this. Let's generate insights. Let's try to make a more complex course analysis for this. And that people maybe brainstorm about courses for this. It could be that there was too much tech debt and you couldn't build on the thing that you had, and that's why you missed the deadline. It could also be that you had poor prioritization and you did things in the wrong way at the wrong time. It could also be that the requirements are set too early and you're not allowed to change them afterwards. So your plan is too fixated. Or it could be that you have no motivation because we're not celebrating the small wins. So people are losing energy. They don't feel like working as hard as they can because nothing good is ever come out of it. And then, of course, when you have an open brainstorm, you know that there'll be some people who will be using their pet peeves. So some partner will say, maybe it's because my desk is too small that we missed the deadline. I mean, they might get lucky. They might get a bigger desk out of this. And the interesting thing about this fishbone diagram is that you can use it in many ways. What you have here is a fishbone diagram where I put some labels on the ribs. That's one way of doing it. You can also just make a fishbone diagram without any labels. It really depends a little bit about what kind of people you're working with. And I think that's one of the things that's crucial about retrospective facilitation, that you need to figure out what kind of people you're working with, because there's not one size that fits all. So I'm very much of a global learner and global thinker. So if I get a completely blank sheet, I'm like a fish in water. I throw a lot of post-it notes up. I love it. Other people I'm working with are more sequential thinkers. If they get a completely open diagram, they don't know what to do. They're stuck. They can even become a little bit angry. What are we supposed to do with this? What do you want us to do with this? What do you want us to put up there? So you have to think about whether you have a lot of global thinkers that really likes just an open brainstorm, or whether you have sequential thinkers which really likes a framework, really likes labels, really likes to know what to do. And you might, if you have a little bit of both, say that half of the ribs have a label and the other half of the ribs does not have a label, and then you can group it afterwards. But that was the Wheel of Fortune, and as I said, I want to stress that sometimes you are lucky. Sometimes it is the problem. Sometimes you can see the cause, but not always. And try to at least scratch a little bit in the surface to see where you are. So that was the first antipattern. The next part of the retrospective is deciding what to do. And in deciding what to do, what people normally do is that they brainstorm on proposals, brainstorm on action points, and then they group it, and then they vote it, and then they decide what to do, and they put a name on it, of course. Here, I think I'm not going to go into detail about that, but think about whether democracy is always the good way of deciding what to do in a retrospective, or maybe you should add something on the democracy. And also, when you close the retrospective, it's quite important that you actually decide what to do. So instead of having 17 points that the whole team should be responsible for, you put them into one zero action that says retrospective actions, and then you forget about it. That's the worst thing you could do. If you do that, the retrospective has been a waste of time. You have to think about that these action points, or experiments, if people don't like changes, you can call it experiments, that they are first-class citizens. So when they come back to their desk and they look at the A show or the Jira board or whatever it is they're looking at, these retrospective action points should be at the same place as all the other things. They should be as important as the things that the outside stakeholders are interested in. Because if not, you will probably not get it done. And at the next retrospective, you'll ask what happened to the action points, and people say, I forgot about them, or I didn't have time. And then this nagging feeling about wasting time on retrospectives will start building up. And no matter how fun you make the retrospectives, no matter how colorful you use of charts, if these retrospectives are not changing people's lives for the better, they will start hating them. Now, these stages of a retrospective, I think, are important. And I think it's important that you let people know where they are in the retrospective. I never tell people how many minutes we're going to stay in each stage, because I don't even know that myself. I have an idea about it, but I don't know for sure. But I know I'm going through these 5 stages. And when I'm gathering data, I don't want people to start saying, I think we should do this, or suggest that. I want to tell them, take these thoughts out of your brain, put it on a piece of paper, and put it somewhere else. It's okay that you have these thoughts, but don't react on it right now. It's very important when you have any kind of meeting that people are on the same page. That's also why De Bono wrote these 6 thinking hats that some of you might have seen. And you can say in general that a meeting has a life cycle where you start an agreement, hopefully, about what the meeting is about and why you have the meeting. Then you have this divergence where people are sharing stories, you're sharing ideas. We're sort of trying to find out how big is this discussion, how far out are we going to take arguments and stories. Then we're in the grown zone where people can disagree and they can sort of try out the ideas on each other. And then at the end we go to the convergence where hopefully people are starting to agree on what it is that we should decide on. We're cutting off branches in the discussion, and we're entering in some sort of decision making. All meetings and all retrospectives should look like this. And what's important is to figure out, for you as a facilitator, either of a retrospective or a meeting in general, where do you need to support your team? Is it the kind of team that don't know what the meetings is about? Then you need to support them here. You need to support them in why do we have this? Maybe in the invitation, maybe with the people you invite, maybe with like the things you send out, or maybe the first 5 minutes of the meeting you read something together. Maybe you have a problem with starting the divergence. Maybe they don't know what to do. Maybe they're just sitting there. You're giving them a lot of colorful post-it notes, but they're just looking at them and looking at you. So in those cases, maybe you can help them. Instead of having this very open-ended, you can tell them, like having, for instance, a team radar where they should vote for how they are with the happiness, with the communication, with the quality of the software. It might be easier for them to just vote instead of saying something. Then we have the grown zone. A lot of the teams that I work with, developers and engineers, they struggle with the grown zone because when they have a problem, they just solve it. Like they're experts in solving problems. They don't even want to think about it or talk to other people about it. They know exactly how to solve it. It's what they've been brought up with. It's what they're really good at doing. So sometimes when you want to generate insights, you want to have a discussion, they don't want to do that. They want to talk about what we should do. So if you have a team that's like that, you have to almost physically keep that conversation open with them to make sure that you think about things and you do a course analysis. Some of them struggle with convergence, with making decision, and then that's where you have to solve it for them. Some of them struggling with decision making to figure out what is that we want to take away from this meeting, and then you have to help them with that. So your job as a facilitator is not to know as many activities as possible, but your job as a facilitator is to know your team and support them when they have problems. You're not the one who has to solve the problems. You're not the one who have to decide what to do, but you have to figure out what kind of help they need. Which brings me to the next antipattern, which is called in the soup. And you'll see here that my octopus is trying to lift a weight that's too heavy for it. So the octopus is representative for a team because, you know, an octopus has 60% of their intelligence in the tentacles and the rest in what looks like a head for us. And it's a bit like a team. Like everybody has their own intelligence, but together we can do something when we put all our intelligence together. But here we actually see an example of a situation where the octopus cannot lift the weight. So I see this sometimes if I have a team where there's a recurring problem, a little bit like the Groundhog Day that I said. They're always complaining about the test management system. Maybe they're complaining about some other teams. Maybe they're complaining about the canteen. Maybe they're complaining about COVID, whatever. And in those cases, it might be a good idea to just use the soup activity. So the refactored solution to being in the soup antipattern is to use this activity. And what I do is that I draw 2 circles, and I say, move the things that you can do something about into the innermost circle, move the things that you can influence or say something about into the outermost circle, and the things you can't change, the things you just have to live with, they're in the soup, they're outside. I use this after gathering data with teams where I have a recurring thing that they can't change, and I want them to accept that there are things they can't change and learn to live with it. Because if they continue to complain about it, they'll just drag the energy out of the entire team. I also sometimes use it to put up a mirror if I have a team that's always complaining about other people. Everything I'm discussing with them is always somebody else's fault. Then I drag the data through this, and I ask them to take a step back and please look at it. And I say, what do you see? And they say, well, we have a lot of stuff in the soup. I say, yeah, okay. So everything you're complaining about on a day-to-day basis is something that you can't change? Is that really so? And then I have a discussion with them, trying to take responsibility for the things that are in the soup. So you can use this either to say, okay, we're only going to discuss things that you can do something about and not discuss the other things. Or you might look at it and have a conversation about it when you're generating insights and try to figure out if you actually can change something. Let's look at an example. So maybe they've said that COVID makes it hard to socialize. That's in the soup. We have too much tech debt. That's something we can do something about. And the communication with the testers is bad. That's something we can't change on our own, but we can influence it. And then when we have a discussion about it, we might be able to carve some things out of this and say, okay, we can't change COVID, but maybe we can change the way that we socialize now that we have COVID. We can't change the communication with the testers on our own, but there's maybe something we can do to improve it, just with the people who are here. I also sometimes use this soup diagram after they have come up with proposals for action points. Because if there's something that's frustrating and taking the energy out of you, is if you come up with action points that other people should do. Or action points that you only have influence over. Because then when we look at it next time, they'll say, we didn't do this, or they didn't do this, or it didn't work, that email didn't work, that meeting didn't work. Okay, so the retrospective is a waste of time. There's so many ways a retrospective can become a waste of time. It's simple to facilitate retrospectives, but it's not easy. It's a little bit like losing weight. So in the soup is an antipattern you can be in if people are trying to solve things that they can't solve. The interesting thing about it is also that sometimes if you've made the soup activity, you might invite some people from outside the team to the next retrospective, because then, of course, the circle of influence becomes bigger. The next one I want to talk about is prime directive ignorance. Some of you might have read the first book on project retrospectives by Norm Kurth. Norm Kurth wrote the prime directive, and I put it here so you can read it while I drink water. So, what Norm Kurth is saying here is that when we enter a retrospective, we should try to have the mindset that everybody did the best they could, given what they knew, the situation and the circumstances. This is something that has caused a bit of controversy, because people are saying, I know Peter was lazy, I know Susan was stupid, I know we should have fired Hans. I'm trying to make it a bit Swedish here. But that's not the point of a retrospective. The point of a retrospective is not to find somebody to blame and to get them fired and to tell them off. The point about a retrospective is to find out how we can improve the system that is everybody in this room, that is this team and the processes, the communication challenge. That's what we want to do. Because if we at least try to have this mindset, then we can share, appreciate and learn. People don't share if they're afraid that they'll be made scapegoats. People don't appreciate other people's mistakes if they're worried about it. People don't learn if they shut down because they try to protect themselves. So we come back to understand everything is to forgive everything. Most of the time, because I looked a little bit into IKEA. Some of their old things. And what I noticed is that they have this doormat that they called after the Danish city Køge. Thank you very much. And also there's also a toilet seat that bears the name of, it's a very Danish name. So yeah, you know, to understand everything is to forgive everything to a certain extent. But let's move on. The next antipattern is called the loudmouth. So some of you might have had a loudmouth in a meeting or a retrospective, somebody who likes to hear themselves talk, somebody who talks a lot all the time. Maybe they're interrupting, maybe they're just giving long stories. They can't, you ask for about, okay, so feed in for 1 minute, how was this last sprint for you? And after 7 minutes, you're trying to make them stop. And you're trying little timers, and it says, when it says ding, you should stop talking and things like that. Some people are like really resilient towards these things. So the general thing for me is to is to accept that you have a loud mouth, but not let the loud mouth talk, because then you're in the loud mouth anti-pattern. What you need to do is to try to figure out how can you plan the retrospective so that the loud mouth is not thriving so much. And those plenary discussions that we like so much here does not work if you have a loud mouth. So what you should do, instead of saying, let's all discuss this, is to maybe making a think, pair, share, or the liberating structures calls it 1, 2, for all, where you say, think about this subject for 30 seconds, everybody, quietly, then talk to people 2 and 2, and then share if you want to. And why do we do that? Well, we do that because some people like to talk, and some people don't like to talk. And there's so many different causes for it. You remember I talked about global and sequential learners. There's also another spectrum, is active thinkers and reflective thinkers. Reflective thinkers, they need time to think. They need to think before they can say something. Active thinkers, on the other hand, they need to talk to think. And you will have been in meetings with active thinkers, and you can tell from what they're saying that they are thinking while they're speaking. This is their way of thinking, right? So if you have people on this spectrum, they could also be in the middle. Think about that. Think about allowing people time to reflect whilst allowing people time to talk, so that everybody gets a chance to think before you share into the plenary pool. You can also maybe have more writings or something like that. The next one is do it yourself. So the do-it-yourself anti-pattern is the situation where it's always the same person who is facilitating the retrospective. I don't want to say anything bad about Scrum, but one thing that it has implemented is the fact that it's always the Scrum Master who is facilitating all the retrospectives, and I think that's a problem. I think it's a problem because when you are facilitating, it's actually a really difficult job. You have to be super observant about the time, about the phases you're going through, about the discussions, about people's body language, about the energy in the room, about how much time do you need to end this, to finalize this retrospective, how are you going to make decision making. There are all these things to think about. And if you think about all these things, you don't get to have a retrospective. And if you're a Scrum Master, for instance, you're part of the team, so you want a retrospective as well. On the other hand, if you go into the discussions because you're part of the team, then you forget to be a facilitator. And then somebody might say, why aren't we moving on now? Why are we constantly discussing this? And I remember when I was facilitating for my own team, I constantly had this problem that I was very interested in the discussions and trying to come up with action points, so I forgot to be a facilitator. So what you can do is different things. You can ask other people in the team maybe to facilitate. Or you can, if you have an organization, you can do what we did some years ago, that we had a lot of teams who needed facilitation of retrospectives, and we had a lot of people who were facilitators in the organization, and we had a shared sheet where people could say, I want facilitation, and people could sign up for it. Some teams wanted the same facilitator all the time. Some teams wanted a new facilitator every time. And the good thing was that when other people are facilitating your team, you can actually learn from them. You can learn from the way that they facilitate. Of course, you have to make sure that there's trust in this. You don't want to be in other teams' retrospectives and then start talking about it and laughing about how stupid they've been. If you do that, then this plan doesn't work. Of course, you can also take an external retrospective facilitator. That's what I do. A lot of my work is facilitating other people's retrospectives. And that's why sometimes I sound a little bit negative when I'm talking about retrospective facilitation, because when people ask me to come and facilitate a retrospective, it's not because everybody loves retrospectives and it's going very well. They ask me to come when people hate retrospectives. They think they are a glorified waste of time and people don't want to do it. So I sometimes have a little bit of a negative input. if you have to make people facilitate retrospectives that are not used to facilitating retrospectives, there are things you can do. Alan Kelly, who's a speaker at this conference, has made some dialogue sheets that you can download and print out, and you can make a retrospective board game with those. Or you can use some online help, like this is Nitro, which you can sign up for, and then it takes you through a retrospective. You don't have to know how to facilitate very much, it just tells you what to do all the time. So I could definitely recommend something like this. So that was the do-it-yourself retrospective anti-pattern. The last retrospective anti-pattern I want to talk about is disregard for preparation. This is an anti-pattern that I wrote before COVID. It's about doing online retrospectives. And I know that most of you have done online retrospectives now, and some of you have started doing hybrid retrospectives now. So I just want to say a little bit about that. When you are facilitating an online retrospective, you need to prepare a little bit more. That's why I call it disregard for preparation. You need to prepare some sort of board, mural, maybe use Nitro or whatever. You have to prepare something. You can't just go into the room and start writing things on the boards. Or maybe you can do that online with some things I know, but I can't personally do that. I have to prepare. So send the link to people the day before, because then you don't have the first 3 minutes of people saying, where's the link? Do I need to log in? Is it the same as last one? So send the link the day before and ask them to make sure they can. Send an email 15 minutes before the retrospective and say, go out and get your cup of coffee now and get a bio break now. Because otherwise, when people show up, in online meetings, they're like, oh, Jesper's not here. Right, then I can go get a cup of coffee, and then they leave. And then Anna comes and she's like, okay, if he went and got a cup of coffee, I can go get a cup of coffee. And then it takes maybe 7 to 10 minutes before you start. And you don't have a lot of time as it is. I would say an hour and 15 minutes, an hour and a half for a retrospective. And then 10 minutes is actually a very big percentage of that time. If people want to make hybrid retrospectives where some people are happily in a very good video recording room and other people are remote, say you don't want to do that. Because it's so difficult to be equal like that. The people who are in the same room can talk together in a much higher level than the people who are remote. So it doesn't feel nice for them. And don't record the retrospective. That's just really stupid. None of you would do that. So, just to sum up. Now when you say to people you're going to have a retrospective, they're going to love it. Because you will solve the problems, not the symptoms. You will make sure everybody's on the same page. There'll be nobody gathering data while other people are deciding what to do. You will allow time for small talk and preparation before you start the meeting. So show up 5 minutes before, whether it's online or on-site. Show up before the retrospective so that the people who want to small talk are getting accustomed to the fact that if they want to small talk, we do that before we start instead of after we should have started. Focus on what you can do, use the soup diagram. Don't try to solve problems that are other people's problems. Accept what you can't change and learn to live with it in one way or the other. Change the organization. Deal with the things you cannot change. Make it safe for people to speak up. Building on the psychological safety and trust is something that you can do a little bit about at the retrospective because you're building that relation, but you have to do the rest outside the retrospective. And have a meeting facilitator for each meeting. And then remember one thing about retrospectives. Retrospectives don't solve anything. They just show you where the problems are. And then you have to do the hard work afterwards. Thank you for your time.